All right, welcome back, everyone. We've got our next talk for the afternoon. Michelle Irvine, Quantifying the Impact of Documentation, Findings from DORA Research. You can find her doing backcountry canoe work, backcountry canoe stuff in the north, in Ontario, in Nunavut, and the Yukon. And she's got a collection of camping recipes and camp food preparation, so go to her for those information bits as well. And welcome to the stage, Michelle Irvine.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Michelle Irvine. I'm a technical writer with Google Cloud, and I'm also have been doing some research with the DORA research program. I find that it can be hard as technical communicators. It can be hard for us to point to concrete evidence about impact that our documentation has. And it can be very rare for us to have numbers that we can put on these impacts as well. We do have lots of metrics that we work with, from page views to readability scores, and these metrics are meaningful. But when we can tie this into a story about impact, we have a lot more of a compelling story for our stakeholders, both our engineering colleagues and people in other technical roles, and also our business decision makers. So let's take a look at the story about documentation that we can tell from the DORA research program. I'm going to start by giving you an overview of the larger research program, and I'm going to talk about how we've measured documentation quality, and then we'll jump into the impacts. And then before we wrap up, one of the great things about this program is we have looked at lots of different things, not just documentation. But for documentation, we've looked at impacts, but we've also looked at a bunch of practices and resources that you can put in place to improve documentation quality. So I'll go over that as well. All right, the DORA research program. This is a research program. It's been running for about 10 years, maybe just over 10 years. And what we look at is the development, delivery, and operation of software. So we're squarely in the software world for this. It's survey-based, and over the past 10 years, we've had respondents. We have data from over 36,000 respondents. So our findings are based on a lot of data. And even though the research team, we're all part of Google Cloud, what we study is software development across the industry. So we're not focused on Google Cloud, we're not focused on Google. It's possible that some people at Google are responding to the survey because we work in software as well. But we look at people across the industry. This is a graphic from 2002, I think. Yeah. So global, big companies, small companies, lots of different contexts. And even though I say that respondents come from around the world, even though I say that respondents come from across the industry, that's because we're talking about software. What this means on the ground is that we also have people from lots of different industries, as I'm sure you all know. So even though we're working with software, the larger organization might be technology, but it might be healthcare, pharmaceutical, retail, education, and all of these different contexts. So one of the things about having such a broad set of data and respondents from all these different contexts is the findings that we get are also at a level that are applicable to all of these different contexts as well. So let's take a look at documentation. What we have specifically looked at is internal documentation. So we're asking about the content that people are using as they're working with software, as they're developing, operating, and the content that they use in their day-to-day jobs. This is also the content that they themselves might be writing for their colleagues or even for their future self when they need to come back and troubleshoot or build on a part of the system that they've worked in the past. And how do we determine documentation quality? So we are not looking at the docs. I haven't sorted through all these different companies' documentation, but we do have a set of questions, a set of statements that we use to measure documentation quality. And what we're looking at is documentation as a whole, like experience. And so we have a set of eight different attributes that we've looked at, and we use this to kind of boil it down into just one number to stand in for documentation quality. And these attributes range from things that you'd be familiar with, like clarity and organization, but we also ask about the documentation. Can you find it? Do you use it? And so we use all of this to get a sense of the documentation's quality and how it's being used in the organization. Okay, so now we have the broad context about the research program. We've identified the specific type of documentation that we're looking at, and we have one number that measures the documentation quality. So now we get to the fun bit, which is taking a look at documentation within this larger system. So this image is our model from 2021. This is the first year that we added documentation into the mix. And I know that it's really busy. It's a bit hard to read. But I just want to give you a sense of how many different things that we study alongside documentation. So we've got a lot of technical capabilities, from continuous testing to monitoring and observability. We also look at cultural attributes, like belonging and inclusion. And this content and a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, it's all available online at dora.dev. There'll be a link at the end. So when we're going through designing the research survey and then analyzing the data afterwards, we're trying to build out a model like this. And back in 2021, we were trying to figure out how does documentation fit into this. And what we found was that documentation is absolutely foundational to every single technical practice that we studied. It impacted effective use of the cloud, security practices, SRE practices, monitoring and observability. Every single aspect every single technical practice, documentation was a lead driver of that. And remember, we're not just looking for patterns like this, but we're working with numbers. So we can put numbers on all of these impacts as well. So we found that teams with quality documentation, 3.8 times more likely to be implementing security practices, 2.5 times more likely to fully leverage the cloud, 2.4 times more likely to meet or exceed the reliability targets, 3.5 times more likely to implement site reliability engineering practices. These numbers are really big. They're big, and this pattern is persistent. So this was 2021. We've seen the same pattern 2022, 2023, and then we've got documentation in the mix for this year as well. So this is something consistent that we're seeing, and this is something that we can measure and put numbers onto. So what can you do with this? I mean, first of all, I, as a technical writer, find this really validating, but this is also really good information that you can bring to your stakeholders. Does anybody here work in security? Anything related? Yeah, great. And maybe some people tuning in online as well. So we have numbers tied specifically about documentation and security practices, but these reports, like I showed that big image, these reports have lots to say about security practices and all of these different aspects of working with software beyond documentation. So if you work in cloud computing like me, or testing or observability, like there's lots there relevant for your stakeholders, even beyond these documentation findings. And if you don't work on documentation or these specific things that have to do with software development, I think it's likely that you have stakeholders that still care about this, right? Like this might be part of their workflow, and this might be ways that you can kind of showcase the value of technical communication using a world and concepts that they understand. And I also said, like, this is focused on internal documentation. So this is different from end user docs, which would be like a formal user guide that gets published with the product. But I still think that these findings and this pattern is really affirming for even content like that, especially content like end user docs that have a developer audience. So This could very well be the highlight of this talk because these numbers are big and this pattern is persistent, but there's more. So for this next impact, we need to talk about interactions. So this is where you have two things that work together to cause a third thing. So the example is water and sunlight. If you have those two things in the right combination, then you'll have a plant that grows and thrives. So for this interaction, instead of a plant, what we're looking at is a measure for organizational performance. So this is another one of the constructs that we look at year over year. And this is the larger organization. And we ask questions about like revenue and customer satisfaction. And so we have a score for that as well. And what happens is when we look at documentation quality and we put it and we mix that with our technical capabilities, we see a similar interaction to this sunshine example. So when you mix quality documentation with the implementation of these different technical practices, we see an amplified impact on organizational performance. So let's take a look at another busy graph. This is just one of the technical capabilities, right? So for each of these technical capabilities in isolation, we see this effect with quality documentation. This one here is continuous integration, so it's the practice of like checking in your code so that everybody's working from a common repo, and so you don't have these like large integration points. Let's take a look at this bottom set of data. So this is people working in an environment with poor quality documentation. And on the bottom, the x-axis, this is slowly increasing the continuous integration, right, practices. And then what we see on the y-axis is organizational performance. So we see that these technical practices do make a difference. Even with poor quality documentation, there is some impact on org performance. But then let's look at the top one, the green one at the top. This is the presence of high quality documentation, and you see that impact amplified. And this, again, we see for every single technical practice that we looked at. We took a look at this in the data from 2002. In 2003, we saw the same thing. And again, just like last time, we have numbers. So here, continuous integration has a 34% impact on revenue and customer satisfaction. With high quality documentation, that same impact is 750%. So its order of magnitude's different. And then also in 2003, we saw that teams with quality documentation also have higher productivity. It had a positive impact on job satisfaction, and it had a significant negative impact on burnout. So lots of different impacts and very persistent patterns. So remember, we also have some findings about how to create documentation. So this list that I'll go through, I'm not sure that any of it will be a surprise to anyone in this room, but remember, this isn't just a list I put together. This is also coming out of the research. This is also backed up from our findings. And this first set is kind of focused on skills and resources. So the first one is training. So teams that have technical writing training see an increase in their quality documentation. We have some training internally at Google that we run for our engineers and people in other technical roles. And one of the lines that I love from that is, every engineer is also a writer. And this is just a good reminder that writing is a skill, and it's a skill that can be developed and built. Guidelines for how to update the docs. So clear guidelines for updating and editing existing documentation, that helps documentation quality. Style guides, for example, like the standard style guides that we work with, guidelines for writing for a global audience, that has an increase on documentation quality. These next set of practices have to do with the work itself and kind of the structure of the work. So owners, teams who have clear ownership of documentation, have better quality docs. Because remember, a lot of times technical writers might be involved with some of this content or involved in scaling out solutions for this, but effectively we need our people in technical roles to be writing a lot of this content and owning a lot of this content as well. And so not only do owners help, but distributing the documentation work makes a difference as well. This has a large impact on the quality of documentation. I think that it can be easy for a team, especially a team that is responsible for so many different things. Documentation is not their only job. It can be easy for something like this to fall onto one or two people, but the information doesn't reside in only one or two people. Like, everyone on the team has different pieces of the puzzle, and also the act of writing, I think, can improve the system that you're actually building and the work that you're doing. And so distributing this work in a way that's a bit more even, it increases quality documentation. Including docs in the software development lifecycle, so making sure that there are doc tasks identified and incorporated into your normal workflows. And then these next two are a bit more about the work that you're actually doing, like words on the page. Make sure you have critical use cases documented for your products and services, which also means identifying these use cases. And then this next one's a good one. Make sure you delete content and remove content, because I think too much documentation can be just as much of a problem as not enough documentation, right? Because we're not just thinking about, like, is it clear and well organized, but are you using it? Like, can you find what you need? And in an environment where we're relying on people who have a bigger role than just documentation, for them to know what content to update and where to find any content that already exists is also a big part of this, right? So that we don't have duplicated content. Or if you do find duplicated content and you think you have a better way, edit it or delete it and tell the owner that you've deleted it and that it now is living over here. So that has a big impact on documentation quality. And then this last one is my favorite, and I think will resonate with you as well. But this is to value documentation work. So we found that teams who say that documentation work is recognized during performance reviews and promotions, that itself had a big impact on the quality of documentation. Because documentation work is engineering work. Like, this is part of building and maintaining your systems. We see the impacts on these different technical practices. And so this is one thing that I try to drive home, especially for developer audiences, is that this is part of development work. Okay, so if you are working with internal documentation, there's a lot here for you to dig into and a lot of practices that you can implement. Even if you're not directly working with internal documentation, some of these, like our metric or way of measuring quality documentation, and some of these practices might give you ideas or validate some things that you're already doing. And this might give you some ideas about how you might be able to step up in your organization and give some guidance about internal documentation and showcase our value as technical communicators, even if we're not the ones that can go in and write all of this content. So thank you very much. And before we go, I just want to say, explore the research. There's tons to dig through. The reports are all available online, as well as the questions that we used, those models. So that's all available at dora.dev. We also have a community group. And so one of the great things about this research program is it's this amazing intersection of researchers, but also practitioners. And so our community group is there where people discuss all of this. And please feel welcome to join, but also please tell your stakeholders, because there's lots here to read about and discuss that go well beyond documentation. And then lastly, the research survey for 2024 is open. So I've got a link here, but you can also get to it from dora.dev. So if you feel like this is relevant to you, then absolutely would love for you to fill it out. But also let your stakeholders know, because if there are different software developers or people working with software in your organization, like, we would love to have their experience and hear their voices through the data. So if there's only 3 things that you remember from today's talk, the first one is that documentation has widespread impact. This impact is measurable, and we've done the hard work of putting numbers on it for you. The second is that there are concrete practices that you can put in place that have an impact on your documentation quality. And then lastly, take this to your stakeholders. There's a big story here. I'm sure you have your own context and things that you can add to it, but there's lots here for your stakeholders to dig into about documentation and beyond. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. As is routine, we bring our chairs out.
Survey link.
And we've got some Q&A.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. And of course, like if there's anything else you wanted to add or anything like that,
cool.
outside of
I tried to. There's so much. I tried to condense it. So there's a couple things that I would love to add on to. But
yeah, we've got some time for that as well.
Yeah.
And just going to the top here of our Q&A, do you think best practices correlated with good docs are due to the docs, or are they symptoms of organizational maturity?
So, okay, this is a great question and ties into a lot of things. So the first thing I want to say is the numbers that we are looking at and that model that you're looking at, it's done using structural equation modeling, and it does show us, so it's not a causational relationship, so we can't stand here and say documentation is causing these things, but it's also stronger than correlation. So what we say is it's predictive. So documentation predicts or drives or impacts these different qualities. But then the direction of that impact is also something that we can talk about and debate. And so in a way, I do think it kind of goes both ways. Like documentation quality is definitely driving the implementation of those things, but also when you try to step up and implement security practices, maybe you're like, hold on, we need to write about this in an effective way. But the question itself was about documentation practices.
Yeah, so our best practices.
Yeah,
are they good docs, or best practices company maturity? Right.
The phrase we use for this, I think, is not appropriate for this venue, but we do. I've had that asked before. Like, do people just have their stuff together? There we go. Do they have their stuff together, or is documentation actually driving this, right? And it's like, well, what does having your stuff together mean, right? Maybe it means that you're doing all these practices, right? That's fine. It's still work, right? Like documentation doesn't just appear. Even if you have these practices, it doesn't just maintain itself. So I think that even if a company is mature and it has lots of other good practices in place, I think this is still a very active thing.
Yeah, that's definitely a chicken and egg challenge here to
try
to
a little
explain.
bit. But also, our data is, it's kind of like a snapshot, right? Like we get responses from people in time, but I think it's important to remember that what you're seeing is not static, right? So even if companies have good processes, they're mature, that doesn't mean that your doc is just high quality and will stay high quality. Even the act of maintaining the documentation and keeping it at that level, that's also active, right? So these are very dynamic things. Yeah.
Awesome answer with a very tough one here.
Oh no,
that one was. So. Next question here. How is the continuous integration score calculated?
Take a look at the questions that we've got published. So it's calculated in a very similar way to documentation quality, in that we have a bunch of different attributes of the thing we're trying to measure, and we have statements about them, and we've got an agree to disagree scale, and then we take that and we express it as one number. So the process of doing that is the same as documentation, but take a look online, DORA.dev, and we'll have the statements that are specific to continuous integration included there as well,
awesome.
as well as all of our other constructs.
Yeah, DORA.dev, just in case if you wanted to take a deeper look into that.
Yeah.
The next question here, how do you prioritize the documentation standards that you proposed when there isn't a lot of bandwidth to go around? How can understaffed teams improve their documentation?
That's a great question. So first of all, I think that these findings, one of the ways we can use them is to validate or advocate for investments in documentation, right? So that could be headcount, it could be money for training, and all of those things. But also, a lot of these things are not like extra resources that you need, right? Like, we're already doing work. Whatever the size of your team, we're already doing the work. And so if we make sure we have owners for the documentations and we're integrating it into the workflow, then it will still elevate our documentation quality, even if it's not fixing everything, right? Like, no documentation's ever done, but like internal documentation is always going to be churning, and it's still an environment where you can still talk to a colleague, right? But we're talking about like scaling knowledge, and so that does have a payoff as well, which is what we see in the findings, and also like the payoff in terms of productivity and things like that too. But remember, like, documentation is also expensive. It's expensive to create and it's expensive to maintain, right? So this is why you wouldn't just like, as much as documentation is important, you wouldn't tell your whole engineering team to like stop everything and only document, right? Like, that's not effective. And it's maybe not even effective to document every single thing either, right? So that's why you kind of have to figure out what's critical and focus on maintaining that.
Yeah, so it sounds like no progress is too small to try to get
Absolutely.
some sort
Absolutely.
of progress there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. And then a question here about external docs in comparison to that. Do some attributes apply more than others in terms of how it applies to external docs? Are there heuristics to use instead when you can't directly survey readers?
Okay, cool, because this is one of the things I wanted to get to. So if you can't ask your readers, so that's one of the things about this metric, is we're asking our readers, the readers of the content, that people are actually using it. So if you can't directly talk to the people who are using your content, then yeah, you can't quite get the same score from what we were able to do. But you still have the ability to get at some of this stuff, right? So you can maybe absolutely measure readability, right? And like figure out what organized means for your content and see how you can assess that. So I do think that there's ways to get at it. But in terms of like what's more important, I think that all of those attributes completely apply to end user documentation. Like, I would just use the exact same ones if you could be talking to your users. And then also, this is the thing that I wanted to get to about those attributes. One of the cool things that we saw in 2001 and 2002 from those 8 attributes we looked at is they all load together really well. And so what this means is that in the data, they're all kind of showing up at the same rate, or they're not there at the same rate. So that either means that being accurate is the exact same thing as being findable, which, yeah, they're a little different, or it means that we've figured out a set of attributes that do a very good job of getting at an underlying concept, which in this case is documentation quality. And so I think that that's cool because it shows that all of these things are equally important. I know sometimes there's debates about like what's more important, like a clear sentence or it's making sure it's functional, like the person can actually use the information. And it's like, well, they kind of both matter. Like, they kind of both are part of the same thing. And that also means that starting in 2003, what we did is we actually clipped this measure, and so we're actually only looking at 4 of the attributes now, mostly just to make it a bit more concise and faster to do the survey, but also because they load so well together, even though we're not asking directly about clarity, say, we're still pretty confident that we're still getting signal into the documentation clarity, and that we're still measuring about the same thing for doc quality.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty fascinating to think that it would be accuracy and findability going together, and that's tapping some sort of underlying nature that, like, this is the thing that we need to uncover.
Yeah, underlying, but also remember, again, it's not static, and so what we're measuring, like, point in time, these things might look different, but when you look across time, if something is not findable, then it's not going to stay accurate, right? Like, it won't get updated, or it'll become irrelevant, or it'll be repeated and become redundant or confusing. So I think that even though these things are on the surface very different, they still like work very, like, the way that they all work in the bigger system is tied together. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. This next question, I'm going to read it as it is and let me know if I can paraphrase it or if you would like some more clarity. How did you derive causation rather than correlation? In a growing economy, businesses doing well and might have more time for documentation.
So again, it's not correlation or causation, it's predictive. And I guess the two things I'll say to that is, well, and also structural equation modeling. So if you want to dig into the stat techniques, there's lots of books and everything else. But all of this data, so the set of findings is from the same survey, right? So whatever the economic conditions are, like it's going to be similar across the board, like everyone's working from the same context, though industries will be doing better or poorer all the time and everything. And then also, because we just have so many respondents from so many different contexts, like we do have people working with very poor quality documentation that are able to do other things, right? Like, so like we saw with the CI example, like there are teams who are able to implement some of these capabilities with poor quality documentation. Like that is a thing that you can do, right? But we just don't see it like having as big of an impact on org performance. So we've got a blog post about that effect specifically. It's called Documentation is Like Sunshine. And there I talk a little bit about what might be behind that. And so maybe a team is able to implement this with poor quality documentation, but it might take way more effort, or point in time, it might not continue, right? Like if people don't have the information about it. So there's a lot of different reasons why doc quality, like it makes sense that it's tied into this bigger thing, and it's not just due to a company having their stuff together or the economic conditions that they're working in, right?
Yeah. We've got a broader question here. Any tips to distribute documentation work?
So that is actually, so the DORA research program, because it's survey-based, right, like, and limited, because we look at so much stuff, right? So I would love to have 100 questions in there about documentation, but we can't. So I don't have like specific techniques for how to distribute documentation work, but this is where the community comes in and is such a great resource, right? Because there might be different ways that you can do this that are all effective, right? But things like making sure that if you are identifying owners, making sure that everyone owns a different piece, right? Like making sure that documentation work is treated as work and not just something that happens, right? So when you're doing like figuring out your work for the next sprint or something like that, make sure it's also on the table and being slotted in. And I also think that distributing documentation work, so there's lots of techniques for it, I think one of the powers of that can be even just naming it as work and naming it as tasks. So not only do people understand that it needs to get done, but it kind of like opens it up as a conversation. Like, if you need help with that, like, well, so-and-so is working on this part of the, like, it just like makes it something that can be a bit more collaborative as well and less isolating, because I think that often it could just be like one person just updates all the docs, right? And they're kind of like left on their own to do it.
With that, I was going to ask a quick follow-up. Is there anything that doesn't work? Anything that you would caution against?
So these practices, like all the ones that I've listed, again, you can, if you do the math like backwards, or like the same findings, or like teams that don't do these things also see like a huge drop in quality of documentation. So you could take every single one of these and just flip it if anybody wanted to just like make sure they had really poor quality docs.
Self-sabotage, just usability test there. Next question from Austin here. Where did the 8 attributes of docs quality that you mentioned originate?
I did a big lit review. So I just tried to dig through the literature that we have about documentation quality and software engineering. And so I just pulled it from there. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds pretty straightforward if any folks need to take a deeper look into that. This question here, anonymous again. Did any survey questions relate to adoption of open standards, like either Open API or Async API?
I don't think so off the bat, but take a look at the reports and you can dig through the questions too, yeah.
Couple more questions here. Do your results show that I'm thinking here, internal doc. Internal docs are more valuable in particular areas. The question here, like, are internal docs more important for X or Y team and less important for maybe W and Z teams?
I'm not sure if that is a specific thing that we were able to look at, but I would say that like what we found is that it's just so pervasively impactful that I don't think it's not helpful for any specific teams. At the same time, like the way that we measure quality documentation, this doesn't just mean throw documentation at it, right? Because again, findable, useful, kept up to date. Make sure that you're documenting what needs to get documented and then maintaining that. Easier to say than do, but yeah.
Awesome. We got one more question, and then if you got anything else to add or share afterwards. So from Douglas, loved your guidelines on creating quality documentation! ! Did these come from the research analysis too? And how did survey research lead to these ideas?
So in 2021, we asked a whole bunch of questions about different practices and resources. So we were able to take the responses from that, and again, similar statistical techniques to see the impact on quality documentation. If you look at the questions from that year, there's a ton more that we asked about compared to what the findings that we published in the report itself. That was mostly due to space. It wasn't only a report on documentation. But we did find some practices in addition to these as well, but I will need to publish a research paper on all of that. And then the work distribution actually comes from 2023. So that's a thing that we found last year that does impact quality documentation. But work distribution is a broader concept that we looked at, and we also found a ton of different impacts from work distribution in general.
Awesome, thank you. Anything else to add at the end? I know we've got some time left here.
Yeah, for sure. So the other thing that I wanted to say about end user documentation, especially for things like developer tools, in 2019, that report, so this is before we added like documentation specifically into the mix, but that report did look at the usability of developer tools, and so has a lot to say on the benefits and the impact of using tooling that is easy to use. And so I would say documentation is a part of that, even though that's not a specific element that we studied in 2019. And then last year in 2023, we also had a large section on user focus. And so we have a bunch of findings around the impacts and benefits of a team that's focusing on their end user as they're developing and operating software. And again, an end user guide, like a formal user guide, can be part of that too. So that's a lot of what we do as technical communicators, is focus on our end user. And so we did find a lot of important concrete findings about that as well.
Excellent. Well, everyone, Michelle, Irvine, a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.